Hello, my friends, and welcome to the Two Trees Podcast. I'm John Dillon, and I'm here with Martin Listener.
Hey, y'all.
Jacob Kessling.
What's up, guys?
And Rosemary.
Hi, everybody.
We are continuing our discussion about Mephibosheth today, talking about the King's Table, and his story is pretty cool. It doesn't just have one chapter. It actually connects to a couple different places. And so we're going to be jumping into that text, but before we do that, how is everybody doing? Wonderful things are happening in your lives, I assume?
Fantastic.
No?
Just got done with our second to last T-ball game tonight.
Yeah?
And it was a warm one. It's surprising how fast of a cliff the kids fall off of energy-wise when it gets over 85 degrees outside.
Is this your first year coaching T-ball?
First year, and with any luck, last.
Oh, Martin.
As well. No, it's been a real treasure, a blessing.
A blessing.
It's been a blessing to see these
Jacob,
kids.
did you ever coach?
I coached softball for girls middle school when Zoe and McKenna were playing seventh and 8th grade. It was actually had a lot of fun.
Did they?
Yeah, of course.
They were like, never again, Dad.
The guy I was coaching with was great. We had fun, and then we had another dad join, and it actually be a guy that I went to church with when I was really little. So it was just a lot of fun. The kids were great. There's a different approach, I like to add a little bit more fun. When you coach, some people are very serious. Let's go through the steps, and I'm like, let's have some fun, And so
I find
think
that so hard to
you got to have a
believe.
good balance of both. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I wanted them to enjoy the game, and then come back next year. So
I don't think I've ever coached anything. That's probably not going to happen.
no.
No, I would hate it.
Well, you just wait till Patrick's older, and he's like,
No, I've kicked
can you
that
help
can
coach
down the
basketball?
road. No, he's not going to ask me that.
Yeah,
He
it's
was like,
gonna be
Dad,
great.
stop
Famous
showing
last
up at
words.
these things.
Be the chaplain of the team or something.
Yeah, the chaplain, I
Of
could
the
do that.
soccer
That'd be
team.
all right. No, I had I'm doing a wedding tomorrow, so I was at the reception or rehearsal today. Wedding rehearsals are chaos. You wouldn't think it was that hard to get guys to walk in a straight line, but it can't be done.
Well, it just depends on if anyone is drinking any alcohol. It depends on what kind of drama is going on in the family or around the families. I mean, there's lots of elements that can go right or wrong. And then the bigger the parties, the more chaotic
I've never
it is.
had anything bad happen at a wedding. It always happens at the wedding rehearsal. That's when the fireworks are.
So did you get to stay for the dinner tonight?
No, I hustled out of there because we were recording tonight.
Yes, that's right. You were going to stop and get pizza,
So I went to a gas station and I got greasy pizza.
which you love.
It was awesome. It was nourishment, and I appreciated it.
Oh, yeah. That's some good fuel for the body.
Yes, from the King's Table.
That's right.
That's what I was
Is
just going to
that
say.
is that a segue?
King's
That's
why
a
not?
bad one.
No, it's a great one. So to give you a little bit of the background of the story, King David has come to power instead of the next generation of King Saul. The Philistines went to battle with Saul and his dynasty, and there's a great big battle on top of Mount Gilboa, and Saul is killed, and so is Jonathan, and pretty much the house of Saul falls apart. There's a little bit of an attempt to keep the kingship with Ishbosheth and a couple other people, but all in all, they never really recover. Instead, the Lord is blessing David. And last week we talked about how this image of the King's Table is a way of talking about friendship, of provision, and of protection. And the Bible is going to constantly use this image to refer to being in a right relationship, either with an earthly power like a king, or with our heavenly Father, as in, thou preparest a table before me, my cup runneth over, the idea of God the giver. And we've looked at the Garden of Eden, and we've looked specifically now at the story of Mephibosheth, but his story kind of carries on. And to give you guys a little bit of background about him, he is one of the many characters in the Bible who has two different names. And this confuses people. Sometimes he's called Mephibosheth, and sometimes he's called Meribal. It's the same person. And there are several different reasons that somebody might have two different names in the Bible. For instance, Joseph, you remember Joseph got thrown in to a pit and sold, and
The lion's den.
no, different guy, different guy. Yeah.
Joseph in the lion's den.
Yeah,
Joseph
let's recreate some stories.
and the prisoner. Yeah, he actually is named Zapeneth Paneah by Pharaoh, and so sometimes he's not called Joseph. He's got this much longer name that people use. The famous Daniel from the lion's den is sometimes called Belteshazzar, or Hasasha becomes Esther. So politics can sometimes be a reason to change a person's name. Daniel was pulled out of his country and suddenly was serving in a foreign court, so they gave him a different name. Sometimes a person may get a different name in celebration of a great event, either a good one or a bad one. Gideon is sometimes called Jerubbaal, which means let Baal contend. Or you remember when Gideon destroys the altar of Baal? They're like, you know what, this guy, he's a somebody. He destroyed the altar of Baal. Let Baal stick up for himself because Gideon is that great a guy. And so a lot of times after that, he's not called Gideon. He's called Jerubbaal. Naomi from the not Esther, but from Ruth's story. When she comes home, she changes her own name from Naomi to Mara, which means bitter. Sometimes people just had two names. Moses' father-in-law is called Ruel, and at other times he's called Jethro.
Should we be concerned that there's Baal in their name? Is this
yeah, you should be.
just telling us a little bit of a story, maybe? And
Yeah, it definitely does. So
that stuck out to me.
yeah, Ruel, Jethro. You got Saul and Paul. It's probably the most famous one out of the New Testament. Mephibosheth is actually named after his uncle, who has the exact same name. And so some people think maybe he was called Meribal to distinguish him from his uncle. That way there weren't two of these guys running around at the same time. But it also could be that people were offended later on that his name had the name Baal in it. The word Baal means Lord, but it's also the name of a god.
Right.
And so it definitely had, idolatrous leanings to it. When you heard that word, like the word Meribal means, I think it means, let me pull it up here. Yeah, it means Baal contends, or Baal is my advocate, which isn't a great name for a follower of Yahweh to have. Mephibosheth, though, seems to mean smasher of idols. And so you get this really diverse look at this guy's name by personality. You think maybe not.
No, just thinking just the opposite side of things. It's very interesting at both sides. And the changing of a name, could someone change their own name? Would it be named by a parent or other people? How would that typically happen? Do you know that?
Yeah, well, Naomi changes her name. She comes home and she's like, man, my life stinks. Just stop calling me Naomi and just call me bitter.
Yeah.
Call me Mara.
So what about in, let's see, like Daniel, because they would have been displaced into another nation. So is them having their names redone any kind of a nationality type thing? Like they take their identity?
It is a nationality thing. It is a stealing of their identity and connecting them to the gods of their nations.
Babylon, yeah.
Bel is one of the gods of Babylon. All of those guys, the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, are all given names that correspond to the pantheon that they were worshiping. And so the idea was, listen, we're going to take your very name away. We're going to try to make you us. And those guys carried that name through their whole life, but it never really seems to have affected their loyalty to the Lord. Because you can call us whatever you want, but in my heart, I'm an image of God. I'm a worshiper of Yahweh. And so we don't really know why Mephibosheth is sometimes called Meribal. I've always wondered. I'd like to know, but it's probably also one of those things that you're just not going to get to know.
Are you going to kind of walk us through how you connect the dots as to how we know this is Mephibosheth?
Well, it's genealogies. I know everyone loves a good genealogy.
We skip over those.
Yeah, you got to dig
know?
into the genealogy if you're going to find this. But that's why it's not something to be afraid of. It's just a factoid to know.
Okay.
He's sometimes called this. But what we do find is that Mephibosheth, who is, in all practicality, he's the heir of the house of Saul. but he's not considered a ruler by even the people loyal to Saul. They don't like him because he is lame in his feet. And Jacob, you told us last week a little bit of his story. When word came that Jonathan and Saul had been killed on the mountain, what happened?
Well, it sounds as though that there was a fleeing because the what was typical of practice is that the king would slay the previous king or ruler's family for no contending to the throne, and so naturally, maybe not knowing David's heart, they would take off running. So the story is that in the side of fleeing, that Mephibosheth in that time was broken. His legs or ankles or whatever were broken during that time. That's the story that I've heard.
Yep, that's straight out of the Bible. His nursemaid falls over.
Yeah.
She's carrying him and she crushes his feet, and he never recovers from it. It's not his fault.
Yeah.
It's just something that happened to him. And really it seems
But he was running from something that wasn't even true.
He was running from the Philistines.
Okay.
Like,
so, all right. So my thought was that he was running from David.
From David?
Yeah, that's the story that I kind of heard, in the sense of fear that David was going to take him out. So,
Well, it probably was floating around in their head. David was definitely someone they knew and someone who was a rival to the throne. And so they were terrified that they were going to lose their lives. And that's what politics does. It destroys the enemy.
yeah.
Like it's never just enough to beat them in an election. Like the rhetoric gets like ridiculous during a campaign, and in our world it gets increasingly more polarized. That's not new.
Yeah.
That's something that's incredibly old, all the way back here to the David story. And so what happens to Mephibosheth is he is raised up and given favor in the eyes of the king. And so we view David as a godly man, a man after God's own heart, who, when he is given power, uses it to raise up others. When he is given blessings, uses it to bless others. That's when David's at his finest. But David is seldom at his finest for very long. And if there is a guy in the Bible that you don't want to model your husbanding after, it would be David. He is a womanizer, he is unfaithful, he is manipulative, and at times he seems to have created a really bad place for a kid to grow up. David's house produced some really messed up kids, and they're not going to live in peace and harmony in the court of the king in Jerusalem.
I really hope this releases close to Father's Day. That would just be such a good shout out to fathers everywhere.
Well, it's going to come out Tuesday.
Happy Father's
Don't be
Day to
David,
you, man,
unless
out
it's
there.
good David. Be him. Be the positive moments here. And so kind of what happens is one of David's son, his name is Absalom. And in a lot of ways, Absalom reminds me of Jonathan. He's a prince of the city. He's a warrior. He's the kind of man that people respect, and he understands politics. And he kind of rubs his dad the wrong way several times. He gets too close to claiming power, and he runs away, and he comes back. And there's an awkwardness here. But in the heart of Absalom is the desire to take the kingdom from his father, to see it and take it. I can use my power to bring death and destruction and elevate myself. Now, this is the polar opposite of what I think God is teaching us by the table motif in Scripture. That it's not about taking care of your father, it's not about extending the family or expanding the family, it's about manipulation of others so that you can have more earlier. There's an element here of which all he had to do was wait for his dad to die. Like he's not an old man, but he's not a young guy either, but he was the heir apparent. He should have been. He's not waiting. There's almost that element of the prodigal son who says, give me my inheritance now. I don't want to wait for you to die. And he takes it and walks out into sin. Well, when Absalom starts putting himself in the gate, which is where rulers would go to be seen, if people had problems, Absalom would greet them. He starts playing the political game, and he woos a vast majority of the powers of Israel to his side. They like him. This is the kind of guy that we want. And so they rebel against David, and Absalom overthrows the king. So this is where we're going to jump into the story in 2 Samuel chapter
And
16.
before we jump in, I have a quick question. Who is Absalom's mom? I cannot keep all the wives and the children straight, usually in my head.
That's a good question.
That's a good
Why
question.
don't you guys read this and I'll look that up?
I'll take this. But David went up the ascent of the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went, barefoot and with his head covered. And all the people who were with him covered their heads, and they went up, weeping as they went.
So, what do you see happening in this text?
Well, for one thing, I know this is just me, but I'm surprised to find the Mount of Olives in the Old Testament. It's so closely connected with Jesus in my mind that when I was reading this, I was like, huh. So it's been around a while.
Yeah, it's been there the whole time. And so we've got the king, and he's leaving. Did you notice how he's dressed?
Yeah.
Like, what does that say to you?
Humility, brokenness. So, I mean, I see someone who's just broken.
Yeah, I'm intrigued by this because of something you said last week, Jacob. We were talking about Jonathan being like a blood brother to David. And the way they expressed that wasn't by cutting themselves and swearing an oath. Jonathan clothed the king with his own clothes. Mm-hmm. Here we find that David is expressing spiritually his emotions, his state, physically. And so he is barefoot. He's not wearing kingly sandals. He's not got his he's not riding out to war. He's in mourning.
Almost walking like a beggar.
Walking like a beggar, yeah. This is the way someone would approach a funeral, with their head covered, with their eyes down, and everyone is modeling themselves after the way the king is dressing. So that's 2 Samuel 15:30. And we're getting this image. David is being driven out of the city. This is upsetting. This is broken, and everything feels wrong. Let's jump into 16, verses 1 through 4.
When David had passed a little beyond the summit, Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth, met him with a couple of donkeys saddled, bearing 200 loaves of bread, 100 bunches of raisins, 100 of summer fruits, and a skin of wine. And the king said to Ziba, "Why have you brought these?" Ziba answered, "The donkeys are for the king's household to ride on, the bread and summer fruit for the young men to eat, and the wine for those who faint in the wilderness to drink." And the king said, "And where is your master's son?" Ziba said to the king, "Behold, he remains in Jerusalem, for he said, 'Today the house of Israel will give me back the kingdom of my father.'" Then the king said to Ziba, "Behold, all that belonged to
Mephibosheth
is now yours." And Ziba said, "I pay homage. Let me ever find favor in your sight, my lord the king."
So this is a weird passage, and there's something strange going on here. And so we're reading this, and so David is leaving. He feels like everyone is against him. The whole town has turned against him. They're singing the praises of Absalom, his son, who's taken over and is going to be hailed as the new king of Jerusalem. By the way, Absalom's mom is named Maachah.
Oh, right. Okay.
That was, yep. So it's not Bathsheba, if that's what you were wondering, but it's the same mom as Tamar that you're going to meet later on in the story. But at the top of the hill is Ziba. We've met this guy before. He is the servant of Saul. He's the one who's been taking care of the estates of Saul. And in the Mephibosheth story, David raises up Mephibosheth and makes him the lord over everything that Saul has, and makes Ziba this man's steward.
And Mephibosheth isn't the one bringing him out anything.
Where is Mephibosheth?
Yeah, I know. Isn't that sad?
So we're
All
reading
that
this
he's done
story
for him.
Yeah. So you're left wondering, like, man, David brought Mephibosheth to his table, fed this guy, clothed this guy, gave him back everything.
Yeah.
Where is he? And he gives a very strange story. He says, "Listen, I've come up here, me and my servants, we're with you, David, and I've brought you 200 loaves of bread, 100 bunches of raisins, 100 summer fruits, a skin of wine." And he says, "This was for your army, and as you guys are heading out." And David asks, "Where is your master's son? Where is Mephibosheth?" And he said, "Behold, he remains in Jerusalem, for he told me today the house of Israel will give me back the kingdom of my father. How disconnected from reality does that sound? No one is out there clamoring for Mephibosheth. They're hailing Absalom. And so this guy comes and he says, listen, you're not going to believe it. I'm just telling you what's going on. And as the king looks at him, he says, everything that belonged to Mephibosheth is now yours. This is, again, David being generous. He's saying, listen, even though your master has turned on me, or apparently he has, spoiler alert, that's not what's happening here. There's more going on than meets the eye. This man is going to be given something. And David seems to be acting as though he hasn't lost control of everything.
This is interesting. I have so many thoughts in my head.
Go ahead.
And there are lots of rabbit trails.
No, let's do it, because there's not really an outline.
I think of this
there's
idea of
just some
pride
verses.
comes before the fall. There's that part. And well, he already has everything that his father had. I mean, so just, man, that bothers me. And then I started thinking about the parable of the talent story for a minute, and taking what the guy who buried it and giving it to the ones who are investing it. And I was just, that was in my head. I have, as I said, I have lots of weird things that are happening as we're reading this, but wow, this is so interesting for David to raise this young man up and to sit at the table and to love him as his own son. And now he's fallen into some trouble, and it's all about Mephibosheth. It's like,
so let me ask a couple things here, because there's a couple red flags in this story. Just to cut the story off at its beginnings here. Mephibosheth has not turned on the king. Ziba is lying. He has gone out and he has acted deceitfully, almost serpent-like. He has gone out there because he used to have control over all this property. It was his. And David raised up this nobody, this fallen son of a former house. And so all of a sudden you have here the servant trying to oust the master. That sounds very similar to the serpent in the Garden of Eden. If I can just take this away, if I can redefine the game, if I'm out here and I can tell the king just about whatever I want. And so Mephibosheth puts his trust in this man.
he sees a weak moment, and he
sees it and he takes it, just like the Garden of Eden motif. Yeah.
So when we're reading this in chapter 16, because we're just jumping in tonight, do we know that he's lying? Like,
No.
Is there context before this verse, or is
No,
this revealed?
and some people think that he's not lying. There's a little bit of awkwardness at the end of this story, and you're not really sure which of these guys is telling the truth. I personally think that it's pretty clear that Mephibosheth is okay, that he's lame in his feet. He can't get away. And so he doesn't try to march out on his feet, with the army. He sends his servant to take these gifts and
Ziba's
things.
just taking credit for it.
He's taking credit for it. Yeah, this is an opportunity for me to take. And I feel like there's so much of that happens in our lives as well. We don't really want to give God glory. We don't really want to praise. I mean, we say those things, but we don't really mean it. What we mean is, hey, I am something special. And you're lucky to have someone like me involved in your life or your business or your ball team or whatever it is. There's this incredible pride that sometimes gets lifted up inside of us. Rather than looking to the Lord and giving him glory, we have a tendency to take whatever we can, however we can, and then explain it away as well. It just kind of fell into my lap.
There's sadly to say, many leaders out there I've seen who do things like this for something in return. It's not, I hate saying it because it's hard to know the motivation right now. It seems like Ziba is just being very gracious and generous. You help me, I'm going to help you, kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But I find that there are people who just help people because they want something back, the tit for tat thing, and versus because God has blessed me, I'm going to bless other people. I'm not expecting anything. I'm not going to be upset or frustrated. But when I find that individuals start making lists as to what I've all done for you and why you're not, like this starts to reveal some hearts. And I tell you, there's been a few times that I've had to check my own heart, right? Because you start thinking, well, I can't believe this. I was there for them when they did this, and that shouldn't matter. I should be doing this because I love them and because Christ first loved me, kind of thing. Anyway, just the more practical side of things and how people do that.
Total sense. And I was talking to a friend of mine the other day about this, that sometimes we talk about the spiritual gifts and people really want to focus in on the sign gifts as being like, wow, that's impressive. The gift that has made the biggest impact on me, other than love and faith and hope, the big three, is hospitality. It's when people have gone out of their way to include me, to be generous to me. They're doing things not because of what I can give them, but simply because there's a generous heart within these people. And I think that's the Spirit of God at work. And so when you see the opposite of that, that's idea of using people to get what you want, that's not the kingdom of God. That's the darkness. That's Babylon. And we as Christians, I think it's easy to fall into this trap, or at least it is for me.
So does David have the right to just throw everything that was Mephibosheth over to Ziba at this point in time? And is this a valid contract? Do they have a, you know what I'm saying? He's
David
speaking
has,
his word,
yeah.
but is there some kind of contract and a signet ring that's...
No, there's the word of the king.
Okay.
Is
but
given
he's
here.
he's gone. He's walked away.
Yeah, but the king isn't exactly in a good place mentally.
Okay.
Like if it was me, wouldn't you be looking over your shoulder like, Mephibosheth, where are you?
Yeah.
What about this guy or that guy? Where are my where's my friends? The people who've been serving me, they've all turned their back. And David he's emotional.
If you've been in ministry long enough, you've experienced something like this. And when you fall under attack and you're being attacked, the ones who know you the most, the ones who've been around you, seem to just remain silent. It's really a very difficult part of ministry, because it may be that they don't like conflict or whatever the case is, but the ones who can stand up and defend you tend to stay silent or don't say anything at all, or it seems like they're against you. Anyway, just was thinking about that whole side of things, but yeah, he's not in a good place where he's at.
Yeah, there is a power at work against Mephibosheth, and it's Ziba the servant. He is a liar. And he's twisting this to make himself look good at the expense of Mephibosheth.
Well, and he starts out kind of strong. He comes out with the donkeys with 200 loaves of bread, 100 bunches of raisins, 100 of summer fruits, and a skin of wine. That's a lot of food strapped onto these donkeys.
Did you notice that it's food again?
Well, yeah, I did. But I also was wondering, like, does David always have this happen? Doesn't Abigail come out with donkeys saddled with tons of food, too?
Yeah.
People always, rushing up to him with donkeys laden with food.
The reason that it keeps
about
happening
Abigail, too.
is because it's a motif in Scripture. The provision of food is a way of showing love, care, and support. It still is. We talk about, maybe you went to college and someone sent you like a care package. It would have had, like, I don't know, cookies from home or something like that.
Yeah, when I was deployed, care packages was huge.
Yeah.
It was just like some homemade cookies. Oh, it's a beef jerky. It was delicious.
Good old days.
I appreciated that ministry.
So like Abigail would have came almost to pacify him, like bring this food out. But this guy was coming with maybe a lie on his lips, and he was kind of paving the way with this food. Because at this point, wasn't David and his household kind of on the run? Weren't they?
Oh, yeah. They'd just
were
gone up the Mount of Olives.
That's when
Ziba meets him on top of the mountain.
Right.
And he says, hey, man, I've got
they
these
might have
things
been
for
in
you.
some need because
Oh,
they
for sure.
were.
At the very least, he left the city and he met me up here. He's willing to be seen
Right.
with me in public.
So are we to
that
assume
meant
that
something.
David's coming up the mountain to be with the Lord, to lean in on the Lord? Is this kind of what's happening?
No, actually, this is David. He's turned his back on the city. He is leaving. He is being driven from Jerusalem, the place where the Lord is. But the idea that of going up the mountain is God has not forsaken him.
It's true.
David's not alone. He's about to rally his troops and put the call out, and his armies are going to gather around him. But when one or two people are loudly opposed to you, it feels like way more than one or two people.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And if it's
True.
a family member like Absalom here, David's heart's broke. He is all kinds of messed up here. And so the story's going to move along, and David is going to gather his forces together. And he's left these guys behind, Ziba and Mephibosheth. There's more important things happening at the moment, and this is going to move into a battle sequence. And so let's go to 2 Samuel 18, 6 through 9.
So the army went out into the field against Israel, and the battle was fought in the forest of Ephraim. And the men of Israel were defeated there by the servants of David. And the loss there was great on that day, 20,000 men. The battle spread over the face of all the country, and the forest devoured more people that day than the sword.
Okay,
Interesting.
we're going to pause there. because it's got trees, and you're listening to the two trees, and so we're going to focus in on it. The army fights in the forests of Ephraim. This is in the wilds of Ephraim. This is a densely forested area. Israel used to have a lot of trees. People have been cutting them down for a long time. And even today, it's a big deal to plant trees in Israel. If you guys have ever been there, it's kind of something that everyone is encouraged to do, is to plant trees. Did you notice who it says fights? Who the two opposing sides are? The servants of David and who?
Israel.
And Israel.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is kind of maybe a hint as to what's coming, that the kingdom is going to be split in half, and you have the servants of David, Judah, and then you have this northern nation of Israel. But it says the battle goes badly for Absalom, which is unexpected. It's a bigger army. You would assume that Absalom, the younger guy, is going to do much better than this. But his army is broken, and they are fighting in the forest, and the battle spread all over the face of the country. And then it talks as though the forest is an active participant in the battle.
It's like Lord of the Rings.
I was just going to say, Fangorn.
The trees came alive, started swatting, the branches swung low and whacked them off their horses. Yes, swatting, throwing them against the trees. Like, what are we supposed to imagine here? Like, what are we supposed to think about if we were to pause on this verse and just to really think about what could possibly be happening here? If the trees falling over and on top of, I don't know. I'm curious because I love this kind of stuff. I mean, just think about it and talk about it.
So, again, there's multiple.
I need you to make a definite answer. Don't give me what everybody else.
Okay.
What do you think happened, John?
I think the forest attacked them.
You think it came alive?
Yeah, I do.
Okay,
What?
I do.
Heck yeah, I think so too.
I think a tree
Let's
grabs
go.
Absalom. I will never be able to prove it to anybody, but that's what I think is happening here. It's also possible that it's just a way of saying that creation itself is rebelling against this false king.
Yeah.
And if that's what it's saying, then that's awesome too.
That's cool too.
I'm 100%. I wasn't there, so I don't know. But if I get to pick one or the other, I'm totally going for the Ent variety in this story. I think that's awesome.
The forest devoured more people that day than the sword.
Yeah. And so they're fleeing in fear through the forest. And if you've ever run through the woods, it is a dumb idea. I'm not talking about like through the park. Okay, like if you're out in like Appalachia anyway, running in the woods is a great way to break a leg, fall down a mountain, get your head hit.
Right.
It's a bad idea.
Run into Sasquatch or something like that.
You don't want the squatches after you. That would be bad. And so this idea is that creation is against Absalom. There's a passage of scripture that says the trees of the field clap their hands, that they worship. And so there are moments when scripture talks this way.
Makes them alive.
Nature. It's I think really cool. But the gist of it is the same. God is opposed to Absalom because of his action of lifting himself up, of stealing, of taking what doesn't belong to him. So let's jump on to verse 9.
And Absalom happened to meet the servants of David. Absalom was riding on his mule, and the mule went under the thick branches of a great oak. And his head caught fast in the oak, and he was suspended between heaven and earth, while the mule that was under him went on.
So Absalom is famous for his long, flowing, gorgeous hair.
He had to have some like dreadlocks or something. It had to be like sweet. That's what I imagine. He had some sweet dreads.
It could be. But his hair gets lodged in the tree, and he's hanging from the tree like fruit.
I like to think that the oak tree just come and snatched his hair.
Grabbed him?
Yeah, like a mom
That would
was
be awesome.
angry with their children. Not that parents should do that.
You guys' face are so lit up every time you
this
talk
is
about
so
the
cool.
trees coming after the men.
I know. It's like,
awesome.
I just happened to hit a branch while he's riding a donkey. Like, ooh. And it says it was suspended between heaven and earth. That's such a cool little imagery too.
This expression is really interesting. This isn't just, and he fell off his donkey and got stuck in a tree and people killed him. They spend quite a bit of time describing the death of Absalom. And there's a couple interesting things here, especially for someone who knows the story of Jesus. There are some interesting, I'm not saying that it's a definite connection, but it reminds me a lot of what happens to Jesus, except Jesus is a positive and Absalom is a negative. Right. And so when we look here, it says that he is suspended between heaven and earth, and the mule that he's riding on takes off. He's lost control of the situation. Creation itself is at war against him. This reminds me a lot of Exodus, where there's the decreation, when the plagues are happening and Pharaoh has just lost control. He's not able to stop the will and the word of the Lord. Let's jump to verse 14.
Can I say this real fast?
Yeah.
The idea, it's like Absalom's connected to the blessing and the promise of God through David, and yet he is living in a worldly or earthly sense. I think of this as a little bit of a metaphor as to where he's at. He has all this stuff as from the Lord through David, through the promise, but yet he's taking like the evil one. He's representing evil. So this idea of spinning between heaven and earth, my mind's going to this idea that he has these two spaces, living between these two spaces, or he has the two trees that he has to choose from. And anyway, this is just what my head was at.
I don't think that this is accidentally put in the Bible just because it's weird. I think this is put in the Bible because it's almost a sign of divine attack. Yeah. Like, it's not normal to get your hair stuck in a tree.
No.
I mean, I know lots of people with long hair who have gone running through the woods and even rode horses through the woods. I've never heard of anyone ever having this happen to them. This is not something that just, is a danger of dreadlocks.
We'd like to hear some Facebook posts.
Yeah, if you have ever been riding your mule.
Maybe a picture would be awesome, too.
Yes.
I'm just kidding. Don't do
No, I'm not kidding. I want to see those pictures of you hanging by your hair from a tree.
Or a clump of hair on the branch, where you fell. Because it was, anyway.
But there's this idea that nature itself is not behaving normally. The forest has grabbed him. This tree has him in its grasp. Yeah. And he is lifted from the earth like fruit suspended from the tree. Look at the next part. Look at verses 14 through 15.
And he took 3 javelins in his hand and thrust them into the heart of Absalom while he was still alive in the oak. And 10 young men, Joab's armor-bearers, surrounded Absalom and struck him and killed him.
Why does it tell you that he took 3 javelins in his hand and thrust them into the heart of Absalom while he was still alive in the oak?
Who is the he?
This is the general of David's army. By the way, if you hear a humming in the background, we have an air conditioner running because it's hot in here. So if you don't like it, that's okay. I can live with that.
Okay, so your question is, why are they specifically asking?
Yeah, why is it telling you that it's 3 javelins? That seems incredibly specific.
It also seems incredibly excessive.
So here's a guy, he's stuck in a tree. He's obviously having a bad day. He's been running from our army. And the king or the general here grabs, it says 3 different instruments here to pin him to the tree. He's alive in the tree. Now, I don't think that this is a text about Jesus. I just want to get that out of the way. This is not Jesus hidden in the Old Testament. But I can't help but notice that when Jesus hangs between heaven and earth, it's
on a tree.
It's on a tree. It's 3 nails. Now, I'm not saying that that's what this is. I'm saying it reminds me of that story, that moment of this is an excessive amount of ammunition to kill this guy. And it makes me think this king has kind of gone forward with the idea of torture, that he's not just after to kill this guy, but he desires to cause pain and to cause harm to him. And so in the end, Absalom is murdered. He's left in the forest, and he's taken down. The king is brokenhearted. David he loved his son. He just did. Absalom's only claim to the throne was through his father, and he rejects his father. The only reason that he had power was because his father had given it to him. And the only reason that his father had it was because the Lord had given it to him. Absalom tries to take this for himself. And once the battle is done and the king is in grief, and there's this really weird story about almost divine judgment on Absalom and how he is killed in the tree, suddenly we find that David is heading back to Jerusalem, and a lot of people are nervous. Because the last time the king was here, he was heading up the Mount of Olives in shame. And they didn't stand up for him. They didn't stick up for him. And this is where the motif of the table is going to come back again into the story. So let's look at chapter 19, verses 24 through 30.
And
Mephibosheth.
Yeah, Mephibosheth. Come on, man.
the son of Saul came down to meet the king. He had neither taken care of his feet, nor trimmed his beard, nor washed his clothes. from the day the king departed until the day he came back in safety.
Okay, I want to stop there because that, to me, is an indicator that Mephibosheth did not believe that he was going to become the king of Israel again. I don't think that. It looks here as though Mephibosheth, from the day that David is driven out of the city, is in mourning for the king. But he's not there with the king. David doesn't know this. How many times is it that even though you don't see somebody supporting you, that there are people who have your back? There are people who do love you and are there for you and are praying for you. But just because it's not in your vision doesn't mean that it isn't happening. And so Mephibosheth, I think David really did Mephibosheth a disservice here. He believed the words of Ziba, and all of a sudden, here comes Mephibosheth, and he looks rough. He says he has not taken care of his feet, nor trimmed his beard, nor washed his clothes from the day the king departed until he came back in safety.
Let me represent the other side.
Go ahead.
What if Mephibosheth is just a survivor? I mean, he's lame. He's got to play the middle ground to figure out who's coming back, right? I mean, he doesn't know if it's going to be Absalom, it's going to be David. So I'm going to play middle ground and play the part. You get what I'm saying? Because I'm a survivor. I'm not saying that this is the case or not, but because we're kind of left up in the air, I'm not opposed to thinking that's the case. Or maybe
No,
he was mourning over the man who helped him out. But at the same time, if he is a survivor in nature and doesn't know how this is going to end out, he's going to have to somehow figure out how to play middle ground. He doesn't have a lot of much to play with, right? I mean, he has what he has because David gave it to him.
Mm-hmm.
Absalom takes over. He didn't have to give him anything. I mean, I just a thought. I mean, I'm not opposed to thinking that way, but just throwing another.
No, I like it. There is a downside to that, and it has to do with the ancient culture. If you were seen as mourning the previous king, it was a way of criticizing the new king. And so Mephibosheth, if he did mourn the passing of King David, that would have been insulting to Absalom.
Yeah, I get that.
And so it seems like if he is just being a survivor, it's a pretty bold move. He's rolling his dice with David.
I'd be like, Absalom, I'm mourning the war between a father and a son, and just the heartache. I know this was difficult
make
for
a great
you.
politician.
I see.
Yeah.
A survivor.
Woo! Can I still keep my stuff? Please.
Yeah, let's keep going. Verse 25.
And when he came to Jerusalem to meet the king said to him, "Why did you not go with me, Mephibosheth?"
That's a great question.
Oh, no.
He answered, "My lord, O king, my servant deceived me, for your servant said to him, I will saddle a donkey for myself, that I may ride on it and go with the king, for your servant is lame. He has slandered your servant to my lord the king, but my lord the king is like the angel of God. Do therefore what seems good to you."
So he's laying it on thick here.
Why
He says, listen, man, I wanted to go, but my servant came and said, I will go for you. I will ride out for you. And I trusted that guy. It says, my servant deceived me.
He seems a little snaky to me.
Do you
I
think
gotta
so?
say.
It's
Yeah.
a little confusing with the my servant, your servant, because when he's talking about Ziba, he says my servant, but when he's talking about himself, he says your servant.
Yeah.
And it's just like I had to kind of unravel that for a minute while he was reading to even see what he was saying.
Yeah. Well, what he's saying, just in case other people out there are struggling with the same thing, Mephibosheth is saying, I wanted to go with you, but I know that I'm lame, and I'm going to hold you back on your journey. And so my servant, Ziba, said, I will go in your place. And Mephibosheth seems to have thought, that's a great idea. Take all this stuff with you and give it to the king, and send my warm regards, my compliments to the king. And when the servant Ziba got up there, he said, this is all from me. I don't need your help at all. And he paints his master, Mephibosheth, in a bad light. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. Just sounds a little snaky.
It
I
does
feel like
sound a little snaky.
I think
Staying
he's
with that.
Yeah.
Slandered him.
Well, isn't it interesting how when you have something in your head, you can read this however you want, you know?
Well,
and it
I think
makes it hard
David
to really know
has
it's
the
true.
same thing in his head. We're going to see that
how
in
do
just
you
a
not?
second.
I mean-
So who's lying?
Right.
Is it Mephibosheth or is it this Ziba character? How do you know? Now, there is a character coming later, a son of David, who is really good at this kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Chop the baby in half. And then everyone's like, no, don't do that. That's obviously the mom. Solomon
Mm-hmm.
is famous for this kind of thing. David is not famous for his wisdom. David is a chop them up and
He's
figure it out later
He's an
kind of a
emotional
guy.
guy.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
He's very artistic. He has deep feelings. But
He's a warrior.
He's a warrior.
Yeah, but he is led
a
by
lot
emotion
of
sometimes.
actions. He's action oriented.
And so he's looking at these guys, and he realizes both of these men are servants of Saul. The reason that I raised them up in the first place was not because they deserved it. These are enemies of mine from the very beginning. I raised them up to show kindness to the house of Saul. We have in our minds this idea that God rewards those who deserve it, that we get God's grace if we are righteous enough or good enough. We can get forgiveness from God if we are doing things properly, when in reality, God only forgives sinners. It's the fact that we bring the problems and he brings the solution. You can read this story and think to yourself, oh man, people have really turned their backs on me so many times. When you're supposed to read this story, I think, and the person that I identify most with is Mephibosheth and Ziba. I am not faithful to the God that saved me. I wander off into sin all the time. There's a hymn that we used to sing growing up. It says, prone to wander, Lord, I feel it, prone to leave the God I love. Here's my heart, Lord, take and seal it. Seal it for thy courts above. And I've always identified with that because I don't purposefully set out to betray the Lord. I just naturally seem to sin. I get grouchy, I get angry, I get bitter, I get this emotional sense of superiority that just comes from pride. And rather than seeing myself and saying, well, God needs to give me what I'm owed, what these guys are owed is nothing. These are enemies of the king. They haven't done, okay, so they showed up with some food. Well, that's what you're supposed to do. Mm-hmm. Like they did a good deed. That's not enough. And so what we find here is that there is now a question of who is right. So let's see what David does.
For all my father's house were but men doomed to death before my lord the king. But you set your servant among those who eat at your table. What further right have I than to cry to the king? And the king said to him, Why speak any more of your affairs? I have decided you and Ziba shall divide the land. And Mephibosheth said to the king, Oh, let him take it all, since my lord the king has come safely home.
Guilty.
Which one?
Mephibosheth.
You think Mephibosheth is guilty?
That's hush money right there. It's like, we'll just give it all before this gets any worse.
Oh, what do you think, Rose? Who's the bad guy here?
Oh, man.
Come on, Rose. Follow your spirit.
I'm going to go with Mephibosheth.
Do you think Mephibosheth is the bad guy?
I think bad guy's a little harsh.
Mephibosheth.
I think he's kind of kissing up to the king, and it annoys me.
In a weird way.
Yeah.
Like a little...
What do you think, Martin? Who's the one that you would trust here to be telling the truth?
I don't think I trust either of them. Out of the context, though, I would think that Ziba is probably the worst of them. He seems to gain stuff here. If Mephibosheth is saying, go ahead and give it to the other guy, what does he gain from all this?
Well, since Martin is the only wise one here because he agrees with me, he obviously must be right.
Should we get Jeremy in as a tiebreaker?
Jeremy, who do you trust over here? You can't hear him because he's just grinning mischievously over there.
1 for Ziba, 2 for Mephibosheth.
What do you think?
Two.
Wisdom has spoken. Yeah,
you guys will have to join the Facebook group
get
to know
online
what
and
Jeremy
tell us
said.
who you think is
really
lying
quick.
here.
Oh, let him take it all, since my lord the king has come safely home. Do you think he really means that?
You don't think so?
I don't know.
Oh, Jeremy's hardcore over here. No, absolutely not.
This is like talking to your kids, they're in trouble. They'll tell you whatever they want to get the cell phone back. Or this is what I feel. This is like, I'm caught. Ziba knows what's true. Let's give him everything, keep him quiet, because I'd rather be alive still eating at the king's table than not. And I can't. This is just where I'm at right now.
And here's where I want to go with this, because I think this part's fun, where we can argue back and forth as to motives and who's telling the truth. And I think it's endlessly entertaining. But the story itself is showing something different. David does not assemble witnesses to find out who's lying and who's not. He lifts them both up again.
Yeah.
He takes both of these people who deserve to be on the outs, and he raises them up.
Yeah.
This is that concept of the giver, of those with power, protecting, providing, lifting up, even if you have spit in my face, even if you have crucified, I forgive.
Yeah.
Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. There's this element where the king here is giving us a little bit of a glimpse into this bigger picture. Mephibosheth eats at the king's table all the days of his life. For the days after this, Mephibosheth kept eating at the king's table. He's welcomed there. All of a sudden, we're back here, and you're not really sure who the good guy is anymore. Right. But I'll tell you what, neither one of these guys deserves a seat at the table, but it's given to them anyway.
Yeah, that's awesome.
The person that it reminds me of the most is out of the New Testament. It happens at the story of the Last Supper, where we have Jesus is coming down the Mount of Olives, just like David was coming down the Mount of Olives, and the people respond to him, Hosanna, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the King. He's the Son of David is here. They're waving palm fronds. This is the same place that this story with David occurred, that the Mephibosheth leaves the city, meets him there. The king is coming back into the city. This is Jesus. And he sends his disciples into the city, and he says, listen, I've already got a place in the city. Let me tell you how you'll find it. Go into the city, and there's going to be a guy with a water pot. Tell him that I want my room, and he'll say, right this way, of course. This is one of those moments where he didn't reserve it online. It's not like he sent a messenger in. This is God the Father has provided a place for this meal to take place.
Yep.
And it's most likely, people have assumptions about this, where the upper room is, and we're not going to get into that necessarily today. But I want to point out the fact that when the disciples gather at the table, one of them is a traitor. One of them is a traitor, and he eats at the table.
And he washes his feet.
Jesus provides,
he's already have come from a place accepting the
There
word.
is this idea of, could God have just judged him, called him out? I mean, there's all the things that should have happened. And instead we find that the nature of God is above this. It is providing, it is protecting, that even my enemy is worthy of love, that even my enemy is made in the image of God, and that even if my enemy is not going to behave in a correct way, because I am a loyal follower of the King, I will follow and be like my Lord. And so we have this idea of justice, right? Find the Judas and run him out of there and never let him back in. But we find that the traitor at the table is still welcome there. The same is true of Mephibosheth or Ziba, whichever one of these guys you happen to think is the good guy here. There's a glimpse into the nature of God as a generous host. And we also are called to be generous hosts. That doesn't mean inviting everyone to your house. Although if you have a nice house or you just really want to do that, that's cool. That's a way to do it. But hospitality, generosity, these are things that we can do in the wild. These are things that we can do to make people feel welcome, to make people feel supported. And I think we can all remember times where we needed somebody to be there for us. It's hard sometimes when you feel alone. And so when I read these stories, I'm intrigued by the whole Mephibosheth and Ziba thing. I want to know who the bad guy is. But I'm also just amazed at God's provision and care, that even though there was a traitor at the table, David was protected.
I think that maybe I'm not backtracking here, but in that context, I feel like Mephibosheth could be maybe just speaking from an outpouring of his heart, because
genuine.
He says, I don't really need anything now that you're here, because I'll always have a place at your table.
Oh my God! I think I threw up in my mouth a little bit.
Hey,
I
he
just wanna
actually
be with
says
you.
that, since my Lord the King has come safely home. He's always going to have a seat at his table. Why does he need land?
I know. And listen, you could be 100%. You guys could be right. I just when I read the story, I'm like, this seems a little fishy. So,
And that's the word from Jacob.
that's right.
It must be true. Well, guys, I hope you've enjoyed our ramblings here about Mephibosheth. And I look forward to talking to you guys again soon. I hope that you guys have taken the time to listen and to think about this, and that you remember that Jesus is a generous King of Kings, God of gods, Lord of lords, mighty and awesome.